Hello students, this is Mr. Beckstrom, and I have for you today a quick rundown of the Russian Revolution. The accompanying note guide looks like this. It's linked in the video description, as well as posted on Schoology for my students. We're going to start off talking about how the Russian people ended up wanting to get rid of their previous government. Underneath the Tsar Nicholas II. We'll describe the revolutions themselves, those two revolutions in 1917 that brought the communists to power, and then the things that the communists did when they were in power, and then finally we'll finish up by taking a look at the leaders of the Russian communist revolution and then the Russian communist totalitarian dictatorship. The entry image here that you can see is a propaganda image of Vladimir Lenin. Lenin was the subject of much propaganda throughout the history of the USSR, though he was only actually in power there for about a couple of years, 2 years, 1922 to 1924. So dialing the clock back to before World War I, the Russian czars, much like many of the monarchs in Europe, had absolute power in their country. Russia, while it was industrializing, had factory workers that lived and worked in really poor conditions, as was pretty common for that time period, although Russia was still a bit behind on this. Some of the other industrialized countries had progressed beyond the kind of very, very poor working and living conditions for the factory workers in the cities. By 1905, Russian workers who were just protesting for a little bit more fair treatment ended up being massacred by the Tsar's guards at the Tsar's palace. This event is what the Russians call Bloody Sunday, though the term Bloody Sunday can be referred to, or refers to a number of different things throughout history, depending upon the country that we're talking about. But anyhow, 1,000 plus or minus people were shot and killed just for protesting, just for asking for some food. This precipitated a wave of protests that the Tsar's government, Tsar Nicholas II, put down with even more violence and bloodshed. And the kind of culmination here, what we see is people starting to question the Tsar's right to rule. So, if the Tsar has been sent by God, why would God's representative here on earth really do that? These people seem to be doing nothing wrong. And with every act of brutality towards his own people, Tsar Nicholas II took another step towards ending the Russian monarchy, the Russian kind of Tsardom. The last straw for the people of Russia ended up being World War I. So the Russians were caught a little bit between a rock and a hard place on this one. First of all, in World War I, they were not industrialized in the same degree as the countries that they were fighting against, Germany especially. Their army was, along with being under-equipped, poorly managed. So the Tsar said, I'm going to take control of this effort myself, which, when we think about that divine right piece from just a moment ago, becomes a big gamble for the Tsar. The people of Russia, the soldiers, like, yes, here comes the Tsar. He's going to, bring his divine powers and God speaks to him and all this kind of stuff to turn this thing around. And, well, the flip side of that is if he doesn't turn it around, there's yet another reason to question whether or not this really is God's special chosen person and chosen family, and whether or not they really should be in charge of all of these tens of millions of people. The Tsar needed victories to change people's minds about the war, but he wasn't a good general. Being a spoiled child will do that to you, even if your family can afford the best training. The people wanted out of the war. The war was creating misery for soldiers, of course, but also in the form of rationing for the rest of the people of Russia. By 1917, it had just ground on and on and on. Russia was losing all sorts of land to the Germans. The Germans had occupied a whole swath of the western part of Russia, what turned into the countries of Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, and Poland after the end of the war. So the people wanted out. The Tsar refused to leave the war, and they took the Tsar out of power. So there's two revolutions that we're going to talk about here. I mean, there's more to the story than that, but really, I guess you can't call World War I the straw that broke the camel's back, more like the brick that broke the camel's back. all of the mismanagement and suffering of the people just ended up being too much. That, as well as the calls for both democracy and communism from people within Russia. So there's two revolutions. One came about in February of 1917, the February Revolution. It replaced the Tsar with a more moderate democracy that was called the Provisional Government. Now, the real, I mentioned the Russians were caught between a rock and a hard place. The Provisional Government were the ones that were really kind of sacrificed between the rock and the hard place that I was mentioning, because they were moderate, they were in favor of small changes, they wanted to reform the country and set up a democracy like some of the rest of the countries in the West and Europe had done, France and England, but they refused to leave World War I. Why did they refuse to leave World War I? A huge part of it was that there was international pressure from the rest of the Allied powers on Russia to not leave World War I. So the United States and Britain and France, they needed Russia to still be in the war, to occupy the Germans' war efforts on the Eastern Front. So the Provisional Government made this kind of fatal decision to stay in the war. So that same kind of talking point that got people riled up against the Tsar worked against the democracy, the Provisional Government in Russia. And so it ends up that democracy only ended up lasting 8 months. In October of 1917, the communists were successful in driving out the democratically elected government, that provisional government, before even real elections for real national elected office could even take place in Russia. The communists had this kind of branding trick. They called themselves the Bolsheviks, which in Russian means the majority, but they weren't actually ever the numerical majority of people in that democracy. So anyhow, the radicals got their way because the moderates refused to end the suffering of World War I. There were 5 more years of civil war between 1917 and 1922. The result of those years of civil war was that the communists were able to cement their authority. So on to communism. This is the way that communism is supposed to work, this kind of silly little cartoon. Scraped this off the internet many years ago, so my apologies for no image credit. Capitalism was the workers. Here you see the workers in tattered clothes, in chains, working at the factory machines, making the big fat cat giant cigar smoking capitalist owner lots and lots of money. The workers rise up, kill the owners, take possession of everything, and now look, the money chute goes right back to the workers. From each according to their means, to each according to their needs. Or that's the way it was supposed to work. Although in practice, communism hasn't, unfortunately, ever done that. This step right here never has happened. Not in any real way. It happened in the world of propaganda, but not in any real way. The changes that actually came to Russia were, as you can see here. So in the background, we see images of famine, very graphic in nature, and images of propaganda. These are juxtaposed here because the propaganda images at right, with the supposedly modern farming equipment being supplied to all the Russian farmers, are there, so as to say the Russians are creating so much food and yet they're letting 20 million people starve, or starving 20 million people, as we'll get to. If we're talking about the big changes, to recap on our little note guide, and we bring back the note guide for a moment here. We discussed these things. February Revolution took the Tsar out of power. The October Revolution is where the communists came to power, and the communists were able to come to power because that provisional government, the in-between government for those 8 months that was supposed to set up a democracy, did not leave World War I. So what changes did the communists bring? They destroyed religion, or at best used it as a tool. Marx disliked the church for its role in controlling people in the feudal system. As the ideological kind of founder of communism, though, remember Marx was German. Lenin and Stalin, they didn't want competition for control of people's minds. So many religious officials were murdered. Most of the churches were destroyed. Everyone's possessions were taken away. The great redistribution here. The government snatches up everything. So this is where everything falls apart. It's right, where's my little graphic? It's right here. Okay, so class war, triumph of the working class. Great, hooray! Now the working class government owns everything and will redistribute everything except a little bit of greed from the people in power goes a really long way. Because when the government owns everything, there's no check on the government's power. The government owns all avenues for information. The government owns all factors of production. There's no doing anything that the government doesn't allow or specifically sponsor. And this is the great failing of communism, because when a greedy and evil man like Joseph Stalin is able to force his way into power, he has ultimate power over everyone in the entire country. And he used that ultimate power over all those people for murderous effect. It changed the way that everyone worked. Industrialization and collective farming. The farmers were taken from their homes and put into these massive collective farming dormitories. Farmers that resisted, like the farmers in the Ukraine, had their food supplies cut off and all food confiscated from them by the government in Russia. This on the left, you see images of starving farmers in the Ukraine in that period. And to change wherever, I mean, just a little, it takes away religion, takes away possessions, change what you do for work, and changes where everyone lives. Force people to move into the cities to work in factories, force people to move into collective farms to, supposedly like make more food working all together, but really it was more about control. Of course, everything they did was more about control. People keeping their eyes on each other, turning everyone against each other, turning everyone into a rat, narc, to let the authorities know if someone's not living up to the ideals of the revolution. So finally, we have the leaders of the revolution here. I mentioned Lenin earlier. This is an image of Stalin. Vladimir Lenin, the guy on the left, he was the original leader of the Bolshevik movement, as I mentioned a moment ago. He was a charismatic and good public speaker. He got a lot of support behind the idea of communism. Really the idea is easy to sell. It's this utopia of everyone working together, no one, abusing anybody else, no one taking more than they need, no one being too greedy and ruining everything like they had in the capitalist system, according to Lenin. But that same greed that seems endemic in human nature is unleashed to a much greater degree in communism because when we have a greedy leader, that leader is in control of everything, as I mentioned ago, with no check on their power. Lenin doesn't even really get much of a run at trying to run the communist country himself. He dies of a stroke in 1924. He wasn't a big fan of Stalin, but Stalin was able to force himself into the leadership role. He was a police enforcer, actually, at Stalin, so he had a lot of friends in the law enforcement realm, and he took control after Lenin died. There was a contest of power that I won't go into right now, and we get Stalin, the brutal dictator, one of the most evil men in all of history. And when he was in control of the government, using that total control of all information streams to flood the zone with propaganda, control the minds of the Russian citizens. All of the people, the actual people in Russia, you can't help but feel sorry for them. They thought that they were making these noble sacrifices for future generations, that if I just sacrifice now, my children or my grandchildren or my great-grandchildren will be living in this utopia state where everyone shares and it's natural and the government has melted away and we all take care of each other. That was the great lie that was sold to the people of Russia. And then, of course, on the other end, for people that weren't as willing to buy into that big lie, there was the secret police and the fear of execution and people disappearing who spoke out against the government. Eyes and ears everywhere. We'll cover this more in future lessons, these methods of control used by totalitarian dictators, including Stalin, as well as others, Mussolini and famously Hitler. So that's a wrap for this quick rundown of the Russian Revolution. Thanks again. I'll see you next time.